next in the series in navigating decarbonisation, run along with ABS as we normally do with these topics. MEPC 78 took place very recently within the last few weeks, and there's amount of global regulatory landscape came from this, and it dictates the path forward that we're going to see in this next stage of the decarbonisation journey. Some may say that there's perhaps less progress than they would have liked in MEPC 78. My personal opinion is there's been progress, so any progress is positive. We'd obviously like to see more changes, but when you look at some of the technicalities behind what's going on, you'll understand why it's not just easy as just flicking a switch over to one set of regulations to another. What we're going to do throughout this webinar today, I'm going to go through a very quick overview, looking at from above, bit of a helicopter view, if you like, of what's going on. Then Georgios is kindly going to drill down into more detail. There may be a bit of repetition between what I talk about and Georgios talks about, but sometimes that's planned because, if we talk about it more than once, then it'll make more sense to the audience. So that's what we're trying to do. We'll open it up very light touch and then dig down in further detail. And then after Georgios, we're going to be going on to Helen Barden, whom you all be familiar with from our FD&D department, a senior solicitor from our FD&D department. And Helen is going to look into some of the contractual angles to this and really what can be done there to assist with that. So I'll allow the panel to introduce themselves as we go through the next part of the presentation. My name is Mark Smith, as you may know. I'm a loss prevention executive, ex-marine engineer, technical and fleet superintendent on container vessels, bulk carriers and multi-purpose vessels. So first and foremost, we don't just like to come out with the bad news. We like to come out with the good news. And there has been some good news recently. Biofuels, as we all know, is probably going to feature a little bit in shipping as we go through the next stage, especially with some of the older tonnage. Now, MEPC approved a unified interpretation, and that's regulation 18.3. And this unified interpretation will come as a relief to many ship owners, including some of you in the audience now who I know have struggled with some of the extra onerous exercise representing substantial workload increases for undertaking NOx measurements. Now, this unified interpretation, what it essentially means is that a B30 blend, and for those of you that aren't familiar with B30, the 30% represents the blend of biofuel. So just like in the UK, if you go and put diesel into your car, you'll see at the pump that it says B7. That means that there's a B7, there's a biofuel blend up to 7%. And B30 just represents that on a larger scale in the shipping tanks effectively on the vessel. So up to 30% biofuel blend is now being treated as a petroleum-derived marine fuel oil definition, meaning no further testing is required. And that's something we spoke about before there. That's something less that owners have to do. Moving on from that as well, Regulation 18.32 states the requirements of Regulation 13 on NOx certification of the engine still applies. Effectively, what this means is that engines can't be technically altered or parts can't be changed from the original NOx technical file and the original testing which is within that, but this means they can go up to 100% B100. And not only from various classification society testing, but also from industry feedback from our members as well, there has been, very little change in relation to the NOx emissions based on testing using biofuel. So that's really a step in the positive direction there, and makes things slightly easier for ship owners. So up to B30, you treat it as a normal petroleum-based fuel, and above B30, technically, if you've made no major modifications to your vessel, then it's less of a concern and less exemptions required from flag state than there was at some point. Obviously, we always suggest to notify your flag state or classification society, as Georgios will go into, but it makes it slightly easier. The next part of it is there was a little bit more clarity we're going to talk about in this section here, and that's to do with 4.4.61 and it's the Unified Interpretations of the NOx Technical Code. And this is really related to the engine groups and families and different sizes, cylinder configurations, etc., etc. You need to look into this in a little bit more detail if you're going down this road. But basically, what it means is that there's guidance on the number of cylinders, chargers, the fuel systems, engine makers, etc., to see which fuels can be put into which families effectively and which selected catalytic reduction systems are used and need to be considered, because it may be that a different type of catalytic reduction method is used. So that just needs to be considered, and that's something that's been sort of finalized from the 2008 guidance on that. Next, we look at Act Now, and this is really important. What we really want to get across to ship owners now. We're sure that many of you attending this webinar now are familiar with this, but we really just want to bring the point home to you that the SEEMP Part 3, the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan Part 3, needs to be approved and on board by the 1st of January 2023. The EEXI technical file needs to be approved before the first annual intermediate or renewal IAPP survey or the initial IAE survey on or after the 1st of January 2023. The IAE is the International Energy Certificate Survey, and that's on or after the 1st of January 2023. And then last but by no means least is CII reporting. The first reporting of CII based on 2023 data is due no later than the 31st of March 2024. And Georgios will cover that in more detail at the latter part of the presentation. Amended guidelines. So what's been amended with respect to the guidelines? So the EEXI in-service performance calculation as well as survey certification. There's been some amended guidelines there. The CII, the carbon intensity reference and rating guidelines for RoRo, cargo, and high-speed craft, updating to rating guidelines, and correction factors, which we'll touch on a little bit later on, for weather and protracted port stay have also been amended. The DCS, which is the data collection system, verification guidelines, and verification of the CII as part of the DCS, and the IMO fuel consumption database guidelines have been amended accordingly there. And the SEEMP, the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan guidelines for development and verifying the SEEMP Part 3, something Georgios will touch on again throughout the presentation. So this will perhaps wake up a lot of ship owners, and you know, there's going to be many different views on this, but what is port state control guidance? We get many questions about this, and you know, what's going to happen? Well, basically, as we can see here, MEPC, the Marine Environment Pollution Committee, have requested the subcommittee on the implementation of IMO instruments between July the 25th and July the 29th. And what that is going to do is to consider whether failing to arrange a ship energy efficiency management plan, part 3 implementation plan, is a detainable deficiency. And what's regarded as a detainable deficiency in this respect. And many of us may look at this in negative light, but you have to look at the bigger picture here, in my opinion. You know, if your ship owners are complying with what they should be complying with, then, you know, why shouldn't the ship owners who are trying to avoid this, you know, have some form of deterrent to prevent them from trying to work away from this? You know, we've seen since IMO 2020, the sulfur cap, that every port state in the control um, deals differently with a sulfur content of, let's say, 0.51 or 0.52%. It would really be good to get some clarity in this area so every ship owner knows where they stand on this front. So we're not saying we're encouraging port state control detentions. Nobody likes to see a ship detained. But what I, in my opinion, would like to see encouraged is for everybody to be playing on a level playing field here, and for the good operators to be rewarded accordingly. So on to the next point. And I'm sorry for those of you that have seen this before, but we always say a picture paints 1,000 words. What we're looking at here is life cycle analysis, basically. And at this moment in time, and this is subject to change, we're just looking basically at this part of the equation. So the well to wake, which is the fuel emissions created by the vessel from this bunker tank to when the vessel propels through the water. But as we can see here, we have this whole process going on from the harvesting and extraction using biofuels as an example to the production, renewable energy techniques, conversion, etc., etc. So you could use the cleanest, lowest carbon fuel on the planet, but if the tractor that you're using to extract it isn't using clean fuel or low carbon fuel, it's using a dirty engine that's old and not with the regulatory requirements ashore, and you're using coal powered for your production, then you're gonna have a higher carbon content of the whole cycle. So we can see here when we've got renewable energy, for example, water, wind, sun, solar power, that these are all clean elements bringing into this equation. So really what we want to see is this whole well to wake analysis. And the well to wake analysis means right the way from here, all the way throughout this process here, all the way till the ship actually consumes the fuel. And that's what we want to see. And that's work that's going on in the background at the moment. This brings us on to our next slide. So the IMO GHG, which is Greenhouse Gases Lifecycle Guidelines, the well-to-wake life cycle emissions are required to decarbonise shipping. A current correspondence group's been established to submit a report at MEPC 79, which will take place in November, December this year, to be adopted at MEPC 80, which will be next year. The draft LCA, which is Life Cycle Analysis Guidelines, are to consider developing guidance for third-party verification and certification schemes. That's very important. We need to make sure it's verified correctly by third parties. Developing procedures, which allows continuous review of greenhouse gas emissions default values. Develop methodologies that allow for calculation of well to tank, tank to wake, and entire well to wake GHG emission default values. Now, we broke that down before there, and hopefully that diagram in the previous slide helped you to understand what we're looking at here. So well to tank is right the way back from the well till it gets to the tank effectively. Tank to wake is from the ship's tank till it propels the vessel through the water. And then obviously when you look at the well to wake, that's the complete cycle. So there's going to be consideration given to sustainability criteria issues and develop fuel life cycle labels. That's FLL. And then also there's going to be a case of identifying main and initial fuel production pathways and feedstock for inclusion. So on the previous slide, we spoke about how we really want to see this push for this, new way of looking at the measurements of the fuel. But I'm hoping now by showing you this slide, this is just some of the complications that are in the background. And this is why sometimes it might take a little bit longer than we all hoped to reach where we want to reach on this. So in the next slide, basically, we just want to talk about, we're going to deviate slightly from the subject in hand here. And something really that we want to bring forward is that, we constantly get asked the question, what's the best fuel type for this next phase? What's the best fuel type for this next phase? And what we really want to try and show here is that the roulette wheel is basically, you're spinning in a roulette wheel because it's very hard to basically, as you can see here, it's very hard to predict which way the fuels are going to go in the future. There's many different fuel types out there. They're all suited to different trading patterns of different vessels, and depends what the infrastructure is, your vessel, the energy content. Hydrogen may be suited to short fuel vessels, but then methanol may be more suited to container vessels. Biofuels may suit older tonnage if it's available and the costing is right. So there's many different options out there, and carbon capture is another one that we want to talk about as well. And I think Georgios is going to touch on that quickly. The other in the background, I don't know if you can see, is the DeLorean, which is actually a nuclear-powered car. Back in 1987, Dr. Emmett Brown came out with a brilliant idea, and the reactor within this car would be enough to power a large container vessel. And some of this nuclear technology is being developed now, and we wrote an article on that on North's website if you ever like to look at that in a little bit more detail. But it's definitely a potential alternative for the future as a low zero carbon option. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm now going to pass over to Georgios to talk about the ABS elements and how the Classification Society are dealing with this in their context. Thank you, Georgios.
Thank you, Mark. I think that I can take control now. Yes, I do.
Yes, yeah.
So, hello everyone. I'm Yorgos Plevrakis. I'm the Vice President for Global Sustainability for ABS. It has been a very it's a lovely tradition now that we have established having this update with North of England PNI, and we are very glad to have adopted this tradition. Would like to thank our hosts for inviting us to present to you the updates of the MEPC sessions as they unfold. So, switching gears from the introduction to the presentation, just an overview of what we have seen as the MEPC 78 agenda. And I'd like to ask Mark, has the slide changed from the first slide to the other one, the second one?
No, it hasn't. It should have changed now. Are you? I think you need to take control again, Georgios. I think because it's saying stop presenting to me.
I think the function is disabled, but I think you have control, Mark.
Okay, yeah.
Let's
so we'll go on
work
to the next slide. Yeah.
Yes, let's work this out like that. Okay, great. So apologies for this short hiccup. This is what might happen during a live broadcast, as they say. So, MEPC 78 agenda. There were a couple of topics, more than a couple of topics that were actually covered. In this session, we mainly discuss the topics around the greenhouse gas agenda. Just to provide an overview, the topics that were discussed around the air pollution was the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships. There was a discussion also on the 2050 targets and the revision of the greenhouse gas strategy, a very, very important thing that might change the decarbonization trajectories that we have to follow. There was also on the agenda a discussion on the mid and long-term measures, mainly looking at the basket of market-based measures that are supposed to support the transition to the next decarbonization milestones. The Lifecycle Guidelines that Mark has mentioned also in his presentation, and of course EEXI and CII, as well as SEEMP discussions and implementation and discussion on the guidelines that have been developed. There were also very, very important discussions and decisions based on the air pollution prevention, and particularly on the biofuel side, and also an introduction of a new ECA, emission control area, in the Mediterranean Sea that will kick into gear in 2024. So moving on to the next slide, what we
Georgios, could you just check that? Are you able to take control now, please?
Yes. Yeah, yes, thank you.
Great.
I can. Excellent. That's resolved. Perfect. So it is important to note that all MEPCs are built on the previous one, and MEPC 78 builds on the previous intersessional meetings, namely the intersessional working groups on greenhouse gases and on the correspondent group activities. There are many topics that were discussed during MEPC 78 that were heavily discussed among member states prior to the meeting. For example, one of the most important topics that were discussed and were presented in MEPC 78 were the carbon intensity correction factors. That it's a discussion that started back in 2021, and the submission happened in MEPC 78. So to start, we should be looking into the greenhouse gas emission agenda items, and particularly how the key greenhouse gas topics were actually addressed. As I mentioned in the first slide, there was a discussion of the 2050 level of ambition. Just to remind everyone, we have the IMO ambition statement and the levels of decarbonization in 2030 and 2050. The discussion was whether we should revise the ambition for 2050 from 50% reduction to getting to zero. The other discussion that happened was the outcomes of the Intersessional Working Group on Greenhouse Gases, the Lifecycle Guidelines for marine fuels, the market-based measure are as part of the midterm measures, and of course the EEXI updates and the final agreement of the CII SEEMP guidelines, including some approved correction factors that we will be looking into those in the next couple of slides. In this session, we saw great progress in relation to the previous MEPC 77 session about the revision of the 2050 targets that we mentioned before. Some papers have been put forward asking for a revised level of ambition, including a proposal to phase out the greenhouse gas emissions from shipping by 2050. And there is a strong coalition of countries behind this call, as you will see in this slide. However, this was not the only proposal that was put forward. Some countries raised relevant considerations on the need for feasibility studies, including fuel and technology availability, while others noted that some sectors of shipping may be easier to decarbonize than others. Members also noted the urgency of the matter in order to meet the target, which is to reach the new agreement on the strategy by MEPC 80 in July of next year. The group finally agreed to continue the discussion in the new Intersessional Working Group for Greenhouse Gases and further discussion in MEPC 79. There have been calls for dedicated Intersessional Working Group meetings on this matter between the next MEPC and MEPC 80, and we need to see how this develops further. Members are also invited to put forward new proposals and papers on the topic. Now, EEXI has been the talk of the town for almost a year and a half now, and we did have some updates on that. We have, as also Mark mentioned before, the introduction of the in-service performance measurements that have been included in the EEXI guidelines as a manner to derive a speed power curve. Guidelines for these measurements are provided by the IMO. Secondly, for ships with a shaft generator, the calculation of the EEXI follows the 70% of MCR limited as per the EEDI guidelines. Third, the Ajax draft guidelines on the EEXI calculations were published and have been noted to the IMO, by the IMO. Lastly, the IMO also noted the Ajax draft guidelines on the numerical calculations for EEXI reference speed calculations. This is mainly how we could implement and use CFD in order to derive the EEXI reference speed. These two last Ajax guidelines, we have to emphasize, are published by the IMO and are drafts, and they shall be further updated in the coming weeks or months. At this moment, to get ready for EEXI, we encourage all of you to start working into the benchmarking and how the necessary improvement can happen if the EEXI requirement is not met. Of course, we here at ABS will be more than happy to assist. Now, on the CII, we have the most important updates. The updates that we'll go through today have been extensively discussed in the correspondence group and previous intersessional working group meetings, and the last MEPC 78 validated them. As far as the reference lines are concerned, these have been updated for the RoRo segment, including a change of capacity proxy to calculate the AER for RoRo cargo ships from deadweight to GT. The combination carrier ship segment also had changes for to the reference lines, and there was an inclusion of a new category, high-speed craft, with a dedicated reference line. For some of these, boundaries between ratings have also been updated. And a very important aspect is the correction factors and exclusions. More than 15 of these have been discussed in the correspondence group. Some of them have been further revised and discussed during the Intersessional Working Group for Greenhouse Gases number 12. But not all of them have been kept in the final agreed G5 guidelines, as we call them. And this is the outcome of a technical analysis which focused on some key aspects, such as capacity to assess the effects, whether there are policy justification for this type of exclusion, if the policy calculations were accurate, or if this could be independently verified by regulators.
Giorgio, sorry to interrupt there. I just think it's probably a good opportunity. We've received a question during the registration process about basically vessels' correction factor for boilers and idles. Now, my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, that there has been a guideline put forward for shuttle tankers and STS transfers.
Correct.
And that correction factor is basically there because obviously, just for the audience, just to make them aware, tankers effectively, obviously, when they're discharging cargo, they're not moving any distance, but they're using fuel to heat the boilers and heat various other equipment, which is obviously quite unfair on them if they're going to be penalized from a CII perspective. So correction factors have been put in place to this effect, if that's correct, Giorgio. So.
Correct. And we are covering those in the next slide, actually, where we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the formula. Good points. Now, moving on then, this was a good pass for me to explain a bit the mechanics. And if you take a closer look at the formula, you can see that the formula became somewhat longer than the initial text. So let's go one by one and see and discuss each of these. So item 1 that you see on this slide is where the DCS fuel consumption is captured. This is already being reported to the IMO annually. Item 2 relates to voyage exclusions, and here you will find the voyages such as those where the safety of the vessel and crew are endangered, sailing in ice conditions for ice class ships, and etc. Item 3 is for the fuel consumption exclusions, and there were 3 items. This is where now Mark's points are included. First, you have the FC electrical. This relates to the fuel consumption for refrigerated containers, cargo cooling, reliq plants on gas and LNG carriers, and electrical discharge pumps for oil tankers. This is mainly how you handle and condition cargo on board. Second, FC boiler relating to the oil-fired boilers consumption for cargo heating and steam-driven cargo pumps consumption for cargo discharge on oil tankers. Lastly, FC others. This relates to the discharge pumps powered by their own generator. Item 4 you see on the slide is what also Mark mentioned, relates to the correction factor for the fuel consumption of oil tankers when engaged in shuttle tanker and ship-to-ship operation. And the IMO has set a few requirements for these corrections as well. Item A and B relate to the capacity correction factors which are inherent. It's a heritage thing that came from the EEDI mechanism. These are shown here, as well as the ice class capacity correction factors, chemical tankers, and voluntary structure enhancement capacity correction factor corrections. One additional note here, and you see that with yellow color, is that the SEEMP guidelines, the committee agreed that for the LNG carriers using cargo as fuel, nitrogen content is to be subtracted from the total fuel consumption, as it, of course, does not contribute to CO2 emissions. So again, thanks for the pass here, Mark. Spot on the comments. These are captured also in the mechanics of the calculations of the CII. Now, let's see how the process goes. And since CII is in place, we want to highlight the timeline and the and how this process is going to unfold. The CII is linked to the SEEMP, specifically SEEMP Part III, which will be developed and approved before the end of this year, 2022. Once this is approved, a confirmation of compliance, COC, you see they're mentioned as COC, will be issued. Then every year a process flow, as shown here, will be repeated. By December 31st, the DCS data collection ends. Then by the 31st of March, the data is sent for review and the verification process starts. During this verification, it will be checked whether a vessel has a first E rating or a third D rating. If this is the case, then 1 month later, a revised SEEMP with a corrective action plan needs to be submitted for review, requiring a new COC and a statement of compliance. On the other hand, if the vessel does not need to revise the SEEMP, which means that it hasn't received a first rating E or a third rating D, a statement of compliance will be issued by the 31st of May. Audits may be performed during the year to verify the implementation of the SEEMP and CII, and this is to happen before November 30th. Of course, this might not happen every year. Then the cycle repeats. Now, looking specifically at SEEMP, as I mentioned, SEEMP Part III, it is a new part of the SEEMP that needs to be issued and verified by the end of this year. We will not dive into all the details that SEEMP part is expected to cover. I just wanted to go through some key items here. First, an implementation plan description is needed. This needs to show how the annual required CII will be achieved and the corresponding measures that will actually support this. This measure will be either technical or operational, and they need to be described in this document. Of course, you also need to describe and list the impediments and contingencies attached to these measures in detail. And the last point I wanted to mention is the need to detail the measures and tools used for self-evaluation and improvement. As we understand, the CII is an operational measure, and self-evaluation and improvement is inherent to this process. Of course, ABS can help the owner, operator, and charterer to address these challenges and prepare the SEEMP Part III. Now, Mark also mentioned the port state control items. During the correspondence group discussions, it was discussed to include the lack of an implemented CII implementation plan or a corrective action plan as a reason to the detention of a vessel by the port state control. The committee agreed to pass on this question for consideration by the III committee during its 8th session in July this year. So we will be staying tuned, and we will be updating you with more after this development takes place. The DCS, the Data Collection System framework, is the framework that the CII is built on. And this, based on the developments that we have after MEPC, is to allow for the reporting of additional information, such as the attained EEDI, the attained EEXI, the AER values, the CII rating, and some voluntary metrics. Reporting to voluntary metrics that you see there as the EEPI, CBDIST or CIDIST or the EEOI may be an important tool for the IMO to gather data and derive new regulations in the future and create new updates. We have included that because lately we are receiving a ton of questions about how carbon capture on board can be captured in the calculations of these short-term measures and the compliance against these type of requirements. Even though there was nothing approved on carbon capture at this session, it was interesting to note that delegations discussing the progress of this technology have been actually starting looking into that. The discussion was around a proposal to account for onboard carbon capture in the EEXI and EEDI calculation. So on the design approach, on the technical approach, on the technical side of the spectrum of measures. Some member states found merit in the proposal, but prefer to wait until more data on the technology become available, because there was a recognition that these type of technologies are somewhat low in their maturity rates still. And some other delegations, very important topic and very important note, also noted that there could be merit to consider onboard capture for other mechanisms, the operational ones, such as CII and the Lifecycle Guidelines for marine fuels. So we keep an eye on that, and we'll also keep you updated on how this technology will be captured in the regulations. So as we move away from the short-term measures and into the mid-term measures, we enter the family of measures that are related to market-based schemes. Now, this is coming into a phased plan. We have had the IMO work in the midterm measures before MEPC 78 being discussed and developed in intersessional working groups that happened in 12 meetings. And then this is now transitioned to phase 2 of this plan. And in this phase 2, we're going to have an assessment and a selection of measures that will be further developed and will be presented between spring 22 and spring 2023. So in the next year, we're going to have the presentation and the selection of the measures that will be put on the table for IMO. What are those? Many market-based measures have been proposed to the IMO, and one key takeaway after this session was the convergence among member states that market-based measures are needed to support the transition, as we say. There were proposals put forward for many countries, developed ones, developing and island states. There were different proposals. We are talking about mainly a greenhouse gas fuel standard, a cap and trade mechanism, the International Maritime Research and Development Board, zero emission vessel incentives, etc. But one interesting point is that now one can say that the majority of the countries and IMO are open to market-based measures. Another thing that it's worth mentioning is that in this session, an agreement was reached to develop a basket of measures, both technical and economical. Members are invited to further discuss the potential measures and put forward new submissions by the next intersessional working groups and MEPC sessions. Now, Mark also mentioned the Lifecycle Guidelines. A very important aspect and a key takeaway is the fact that we are now entering into the development of a more solid approach as to how we're going to build these Lifecycle Guidelines. In fact, today, the panels that are working on that have circulated a number of questions that need to be answered as we develop these guidelines. This is fresh news that I am sharing with you. I just received an email. And in conjunction with the market-based measures, these guidelines are developed. And the discussion was around the outcomes of the Intersessional Working Group Greenhouse Gas 11 session, where these guidelines were initially discussed. In that meeting, the discussion was on the types of greenhouse gases to include in the life cycle guidelines. The global warming potential is its greenhouse gas has a different potential to contribute to the global warming phenomenon. Having or not a standard and predefined values for the well to tank and tank to wake emissions that Mark described previously, and more aspects on how you could actually have a unified approach on the life cycle element. The agreement reached in this session was to establish a correspondence group to develop these guidelines, and there will be an interim report for MEPC 79 later this year and a final report to MEPC 80 next year. What was also agreed was that besides CO2, methane and N2O, in other words, laughing gas, should be included in the guidelines, as these are two potent greenhouse gases. Now, what you see on the right-hand side of this slide is the terms of references of this correspondence group with the key items that are now being discussed. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, they have already kicked this off. This includes items from fuel pathways to feedstocks to third-party verification mechanisms. It is a very complicated guideline, but it is necessary to support what we call the carbon neutral aspects of the energy sources that will be needed in order to support the transition. Now, of course, I would kindly ask you to allow us here another note. I would advise everyone to check the ABS outlooks that we have published and the other publications. We have been covering many of these points over the last few years, and you will be able to better understand how these points listed here can influence the well-to-wake emissions for marine fuels. One thing that I'd like to mention on the rest of the air pollution prevention agenda is the fact that we had excuse me, the unified interpretation of the biofuel blends. So long story short, if we have a B30 blend, as Mark explained, B30 refers to the percentage of biofuel that you have in a fuel blend, and 30 is that percentage. Biofuel 30, B30, you have B's with any kind of percentages referencing to that particular part of biofuel in the blend, starting from B7 to B100. Until now, the currently accepted percentage in the blend was 7%, where you could actually use this type of fuel with no trials or testing or anything related to NOx emission measurements. Beyond that, you would have to go through trials and implement NOx emission testing in order to verify that the biofuel blend or the fuel blend that has that biofuel portion in it does not affect your NOx emissions or negatively the machinery of the vessel. Now, what is happening is that with this particular unified interpretation, we take that up to B30, 30% biofuel included in the blend, and we can actually now use this type of fuels without the necessity of doing these trials and NOx emission testing. A very, very important development that could support the faster rolling out and scaling up of the biofuels. This does not refer to CO2 emissions. I have to underline that. This refers to NOx emissions. The CO2 contribution of this particular biofuel blend will probably be covered by the life cycle guidelines, the greenhouse gas life cycle guidelines that we just mentioned previously. Now, entering into the last part of my presentation, what is in the agenda for MEPC 79? Now, several items, although we had time to discuss more things during MEPC 78, some items were deferred to MEPC 79. In the list, we have the long-lasting discussion about EEDI and whether we should include EEDI Phase 4 that has been deferred for many MEPCs until now. Also, some considerations about the biofuel blends, the storage of grey water in ballast water tanks, pushed to the next session, and a guidance on the usage of power reserve and a proposal to include all greenhouse gas from ships in the EEDI, the design index, the technical index, not the operational one. Before MEPC 79, there will be an intersessional working group meeting taking place from the 5th to the 9th December in 2022, the week before MEPC 79 meeting takes place. The topics in the agenda are listed here, and they are the most important ones that we highlight. Of course, the marine fuels life cycle greenhouse gas assessment, the consideration of a basket now of candidate midterm measures that we discussed earlier, and very, very important topic, the revision of the initial strategy. Closing my presentation, we present to you the tentative date for the MEPC 79. It's December 12 to 16, with the list of items that are expected to be discussed. Let's hope that MEPC 79 will have the time to go through all of these items and provide us and the industry with the necessary clarity on air pollution, greenhouse gas reduction, energy efficiency of ships, and the other environmental aspects of ships operation, like ballast water systems, pollution and prevention response, and other items that we didn't cover in this session, like pollution of plastics and other environmental aspects of the operations. Quick key takeaways. MEPC session discussed the following items: agreement to revise the IMO greenhouse gas strategy. We had the CII interim guidelines. I underline that. They were the interim guidelines, and they are open for update and revision until 2026. There was an agreement to develop a basket of market-based measures. We have the formation of the correspondence group of Lifecycle Guidelines for marine fuels that will report to MEPC 79 and 8. And of course, the Mediterranean Sea emission control area, and also some developments in the anti-fouling system. These are parts of the environmental aspects that we didn't cover in this session, but we will be happy to have further discussion on those. I would like to thank you for your attention. We will be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Please feel free to reach out with questions or clarification requests. Mark, thank you for hosting us again. It's been lovely to present the MEPC update again.
Thank you, Georgios. Very interesting, and I'm sure will lead to a lot of questions. Now we're just going to hand over to Helen, and Helen's going to talk through some of the contractual items in relation to these topics. So I'm just going to hand over to Helen now, and hopefully you can take control of the presentation, please, Helen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks very much to Georgios as well. So as Mark mentioned, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Helen Barden, a senior solicitor in North's FD&D department, and I'm part of the cross-departmental decarbonisation working group. So you've obviously heard from Mark and Georgios on the technical update from MEPC 78. So I'm going to briefly go through some of the charter party considerations. As has been discussed, the EEXI regulations may require a technical modification to ensure compliance, whereas the CII regulations will likely require, over time, operational changes to the vessel to ensure compliance. And the developments at MEPC 78 assist with the clarification on the calculations for the purpose of EEXI and CII. And while the primary obligation under both regulations is on owners, due to, in particular, the operational focus of the CII, charterers also need to have an understanding of the calculations and the data on which the calculations are based. For CII, transparency of emissions data will be absolutely essential. And it's going to be required on a continual basis so that charterers can understand the impact of their orders on the vessel's CII, and if necessary, also better understand any corrective actions that might need to be taken. From owners' perspective, they'll want to keep track of the vessel's CII performance and understand the likely impact of a charterer's particular orders, as well as obviously ensure correct data is submitted to the IMO. It's expected that slow steaming will play a big part in CII compliance, although other options may be weather routing for more efficient fuel routes, less time at anchor, reduced cargo intake, for example. And all of these are going to require charterers' cooperation under a time charter party, given that the charterers will usually have discretion as to the orders that they give to the ship within the parameters of those charter party terms. And this is where amendments to charter party terms will be likely to be required, and I'll come on to that shortly. But first, just looking at the enforcement and sanctions, and I think it's really important to try and understand, if possible, what enforcement measures there may be and what penalties or sanctions may be in place if regulations are breached. And this is obviously important from both the owners and the charterers' perspective. Unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't very much clarity on this. So if we just consider what we do know, and of course, as Georgios mentioned in his presentation, keep an eye on how things develop in the months and the years to come. So for EEXI, if the owners don't comply and so the vessel doesn't meet the required EEXI, then the IEE certificate won't be given, and I suppose this could impact upon the vessel's trade. And a charterer may well then question what their remedy would be in such circumstances. Usually under a time charter, the owners will have an obligation to provide and maintain such documentation. So for example, this is provided for in clause 6 of NYP 2015. And that provision doesn't say that it's a condition of the contract, which means that such a failure by owners would allow the charterers to terminate. So instead of that, you have to look at the severity of the consequence of the breach and whether it goes to the root of the contract, or indeed whether a remedy would be in damages for charterers. For the CII regulations, it's again owners who have primary liability under the regulations. For charterers, if the charter party terms require them to trade the vessel so as to achieve CII compliance or a particular CII rating, and due to the way in which the vessel is traded, the vessel gets an E rating, for example, then the charterers will want to be able to understand what their liability to the owners may be. As you'll appreciate, it may also impact upon the drafting required to deal with the CII regulations. So the discussions at MEPC 78 on detainable deficiencies, where, for example, there's a lack of implementation of the CII implementation plan or plan of corrective actions, at least gives us an idea of what possible enforcement measures for non-compliance are being considered, albeit these discussions have been deferred. But as Mark also mentioned, we very much hope that enforcement measures that are ultimately taken by port state controls are applied consistently to provide certainty to both owners and charterers. A key point to be mindful of is the fact that the rating a ship has at any given time from 2024 onwards is the rating of the previous year, and so doesn't actually reflect how the ship has been trading or is performing during that current year. Despite this, we understand that some charterers may, as part of their sort of environmental goals, try and charter in ships of only A and B or A to C ratings. So in the short term, the main sanction may be the commercial sort of commercial teeth rather than regulatory enforcement. For example, a lower hire rate may become apparent if there's a two-tier market for different rated ships. It's of course really important that owners and charterers do address these regulations in the charter parties. With the EEXI regulations, absent express wording in the charter party, owners are unlikely to have a right to take the vessel out of service for particular modifications, and so it's best to deal with this within the charter party. Also, depending on the modification, this may impact, for example, the maximum speed of a vessel, and that's again something that should be addressed because owners may be warranting particular speeds within a charter party. And I'm going to touch upon the BIMCO EEXI Transition clause in a moment. For the CII, these regulations are operational and obviously do require the charterer's cooperation. They do cut across the rights of the sort of the traditional rights of a charterer in a time charter party, and so that will need to be addressed. And I should say that BIMCO are working on a CII clause for time charter parties, and I'm on the drafting committee for that clause. We're currently working very hard to try and finalise that clause, having received feedback following the last documentary committee meeting, and we're very much hoping that it will get adopted and published over the summer. Finally, just in terms of charter party drafting, and as Mark and Georgios have mentioned, nothing firm was agreed in relation to mid-term market-based measures at MEPC 78. And while the International Chamber of Shipping's plans for the 5 billion Decarbonisation Research and Development Fund were dismissed, it was, as has been discussed in this webinar, agreed that a basket of measures is needed. So it's going to obviously depend upon what market-based measures do get taken forward and are agreed in terms of what is ultimately then provided for in a charter party context. So, for example, if it's a levy or cap and trade mechanism, it'll depend on how these levies or mechanisms are regulated as to whether contractual provisions are going to be needed to reallocate any cost, for example. Now, just turning very quickly to the BIMCO EEXI transition clause for time charter parties. This clause runs over 2 slides in this slide deck and doesn't include the definitions, but the full text can obviously be found on the BIMCO website. And I just wanted to quickly flag a couple of points about this clause. It's suitable where EEXI compliance modification is either engine power limitation or shaft power limitation. The owners and charterers are to work together and try and plan for such modification at a mutually convenient time and location. Also, the cost and time for the modifications under the clause rests with the owners, and the owners have a right to amend the maximum speed and the corresponding consumption, although to provide comfort to the charterers, that amendment to the consumption should follow the vessel's performance curve. And with that and 1 minute left to go, I will pass you back to Mark. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to stop presenting now, and if Helen, Georgios, and David could just put the cameras on, please, and then we're all on the screen there. Hi, David. I'm pleased to see you back there now. Subject to technical difficulties there. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Again. So very briefly, we're just going to wrap this up. We don't have any questions in the chat, but we do have some questions asked during the registration process. I believe the first one we've really touched on, Georgios, but I mean, it's more... Oh, sorry, we've got a question coming in there from Rene. Hi, Rene, thanks for that. Understand that presently so biofuels... My understanding is that at present use of biofuels... Yeah, at this moment in time they don't, but the factor that they're using for biofuels, Georgios, is lower than the factor that there's a factor of given for biofuels compared to heavy fuel oils, and it gives a different...
Yes, so there is because CII is based on the DCS reporting. There are carbon factors already that we use in the DCS reporting, and there is no difference between, for example, a distillate fuel and a fuel that it's a B7 or a B30. However, in the discussions within for the life cycle guidelines, there are discussions as to how you could calculate a new carbon factor for biofuels based on the feedstock. So if the audience remembers, I did mention before that one of the elements that's under discussion related to the life cycle guidelines is standardization and feedstock. And there is also a proposal to have a default value when we have a biofuel. So this is a kind of there's a debate and there's an effort to align more or less views. But yes, once we have the fuel life cycle guidelines, that would probably and highly likely also cover the biofuels. This is the discussion that's now happening. And therefore, we will be able to calculate the carbon factor for a biofuel blend based on the guidelines. I want to say here that this unified interpretation, that is, yes, it might be related just for the NOx emissions, just to the NOx emissions, but it's a very good step. It will allow us to start using a higher grade, a richer biofuel blend, without having to go through the challenges of the trials and measurement, and it will pave the way for the introduction of those fuels once we have the carbon factor in place.
Okay, excellent. And then just to highlight on that point there, Georgios, it's something we want to bring to the attention of everybody, that there's going to be increased focus on bunker delivery notes and the fuels that are mentioned in those bunker delivery notes because of the carbon factors, and they're going to have a massive impact. So we suggest that there's a definite area of focus there, you know what I mean, with the bunker delivery notes. But thank you, that's great. I think there's a couple more questions quickly asked during the registration process, but I think you've covered them partially. CII exemptions, provisions for storage, business, short-haul cargoes and small LPG vessels, and any ideas on how the CII rating levy will work. I think you've covered much of that, Georgios. And then just one more question is the main question for me, with vessels already at 30 years old and engines built pre-2000, how far can we go with EPL, OMM and CII requirements for the remaining years of the vessel?
Well, it's not as normally one would expect that these type of vessels, because they were built in another age, they would not perform as well as the ones that are more modern and newer. And to some extent, this is correct. But we have seen that there are in some segments there are particular years where if you look at the global fleets CII AER forecast for 2024, once we get the first ratings, you will see that there are some particular years where different segments perform worse in the most recent years than what they did in the older ones, particularly around the year of 2010, 2011, 2009. But as always, this is a very generic and global 30,000 feet above the ground view. Each individual vessel requires its own individual analysis. And in the context of CII, what we advise is to do that particular advanced analysis so that it can get captured in the SEEMP as the SEEMP is being developed. So it's a very, very critical aspect, and we encourage our clients to look into that as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you, Georgios. And just the last question there, I'm going to hopefully lead into it in the correct manner, but my understanding of the correction factors with relation to ice-class vessels is that they will be able to deduct any periods where the consumption has increased traveling through ice or breaking ice from their overall CII calculations. Is that correct, Georgios?
Correct. And I also an omission from my side. I did not respond to your previous questions about the LPG or the CII levy. Unfortunately, at this time, there is no exclusion for short sea operation. Now, that being said, I did mention in the presentation that the CII guidelines are interim guidelines, albeit approved, they're interim guidelines. That means that the more data the administrations gather, the more data IMO gathers, then the more focused the guidelines could be, and we might have some revisions or amendments before 2026. Now, as far as CII levy is concerned, there is no actual provision for a levy right now with relation to CII, but what we see is that there is already a trend in the market to look at CII ratings, and of course this was something that was expected to happen either on the financiers side or on the chartering side.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's one last question in there about LPG, dual fuel vessels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but my understanding would be that obviously you'd calculate the use of each fuel, obviously as your pilot ignition, or whether you're using the different types of fuels, and you would apply the carbon factors to the proportion of the fuel you're using.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
So once, as far as CII is concerned, you have to report the fuel that you used during the reporting period. When you switch from one fuel to the other, then you have to assign the carbon factor of the fuel that you used for that particular part of the voyage, or the entire voyage, or the particular part of time through the reporting period that you were doing the reporting and the monitoring and reporting phase of TCS. This will actually, at the end, provide the calculation for the CII based on the carbon factors that you used that are related to the fuels that you used during that time. And yes, there is a guideline for this type of reporting. It's based on the TCS guideline, and of course, we would be more than happy to share that.
Okay, thank you. That's excellent. Okay, well, I think that's all the questions now. As always, we're going to send a presentation pack afterwards, which will include the slides, the video recording. That can take up to a week for the editing process to go ahead, but that will include all the slides, the recording, and any questions that you have. Please feel free to reach out to any of us and to ask any of the questions. We're more than happy to help. I'd like to thank Helen, Georgios, David for being here today, for sharing their knowledge, and as always cooperating with us on this very interesting topic and this very interesting journey we're taking part in. And I'd like to thank all of the audience for their time, their questions, and the lead up to this, and their interest. And also, I'd just like to point out that some of our members now are starting to share information on their journeys and what they're doing, and we'd really encourage this going forward. It's an excellent resource. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks once again. Thank you. Bye.